Like any great technology, CSS is flexible. We're going to be talking today about the different ways you can include CSS in your web documents. There are many ways to include style, many ways to specify CSS and have it apply to your web pages. There are four main ways that I'm going to teach you about: inline, embedded, external, and imported. These four different methods can all be used to declare style rules and have them apply to your web page. The first one I want to draw your attention to is called inline. Inline is in the line. This is when HTML and CSS are included inside the HTML element itself. This is when HTML and CSS are mixed together. When I was a kid, I was fascinated by Goober Grape, which if you go down the peanut butter and jelly aisle, you'll see that there's one jar that has both peanut butter and jelly in it. So I want you to think of inline style as Goober Grape because it effectively mixes HTML and CSS. It does this by using the style attribute, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Inline style will only affect the individual element that you style. So this is what it looks like. Here I have my body, and I have a paragraph element. Inside the opening paragraph tag, you will see that there's a style attribute I'm using. And inside of that, I have my CSS declaration, color red. So instead of creating a full-blown CSS rule, I can use inline styling to set style properties. And as you can see, it has the effect of coloring the text red. This method of styling is called inline because the CSS and HTML are mixed together. Now this isn't a common practice, it's frowned upon, but there are cases in which it's the only way you can get something done, so it definitely has its use. Embedded style is when you take all your style rules and you group them in the same document, normally in the head, and this is done by putting CSS rules within a style element or set of style tags. When you do this, all of your CSS rules are grouped together, normally at the top of the page, and will only affect the document that you're working on. To remember embedded style, I normally think of a microchip. When I took my dog to the vet, they put a microchip right in the back of its neck, and it embedded a little chip in its body. So although the chip is within my dog's body, it is separate and self-contained. And I want you to think of embedded style in this way. It is inside the web page, but it is separate and self-contained in its own style section. That looks like this. Here I have a head and a body. In the head, you will see that there is a style element. Notice how it says type text CSS. Within this opening and closing style tag, I can specify as many CSS rules as I want. Here, I've done just one rule, a paragraph element selector with one style declaration, color red. So the exact same thing we did in inline style, but just showing you how to do it with the embedded style method. So embedded style is when all of your CSS rules are grouped together, normally in the top and the head of your document inside a style element, and it looks like this. Notice how the HTML and CSS are separated. External. This is the preferred method. This is when you write CSS rules and you place them in a separate style sheet. This style sheet is then linked in to the head of your web page, and that's how the rules are included. And you use the link element to do this. By separating out your style into a separate style sheet, you can then use that style sheet in multiple web pages. To remember external style, I always use Link from The Legend of Zelda, because what happens is you take your rules, you put them in a separate file called a style sheet, and then you link it in using the link element in the head of whatever web page you want the style rules to apply to. That is called external style. You may be asking yourself, what makes the external method of style the best? Well, the external method allows us to write CSS once and then use it over and over again. The programmer's mantra is write once, use often. So in this diagram, I've shown you how the little pink file is our style.css. This is the file that contains all of our style rules, our CSS rules. And you will see how I've linked it into 1, 2, 3 different pages. So external style is great because Because you've separated the rules into a separate file, you can share them between one or more HTML documents. And if you have a large website, this is an absolute must. So external style looks something like this. You're going to have your style sheet. Your style sheet will normally have a .css extension. It will contain your CSS rules. Here I have one rule, which styles the text of a paragraph. And then within the web page, in the head of the document normally, you will find a link element which brings that style sheet in by name. So by placing all the rules in a separate file and linking to that file, we can use that file as many times as we wish. Last but not least, imported style. Sometimes you want to include style sheets within a style sheet. So there's a method called imported. So this is when you normally want to combine 1, 2, 3, 4 or more style sheets, and you want to keep your web page really clean. So you can actually import a style sheet into another style sheet. And so by using the import command, you can really clean up things. And this is used very often for things like Google Fonts. I like to think of imported style as like a car that we don't make here in the United States. Some import like a Lamborghini. So imported CSS looks something like this. You'll see this @import command. In this particular case, I have a style sheet. I'm calling it style.css. And then I have imported two other style sheets, main.css and responsive.css. This is what we call imported style, combining multiple style sheets together inside the style sheet so that I only have to link one style sheet into my document. Notice how in my HTML, my index.html file, I only have one link element, and it points to style.css. So imported CSS is often used to bring the rules, the CSS rules written in many different style sheets together and to keep things clean. So let's recap. Inline. This is when HTML and CSS is mixed together. This is when the style attribute is used to style an individual element on the page. Embedded is when we take our CSS rules and we place them all within a style element somewhere on the page. External is when we take our CSS rules, write them into a separate file, normally with a .css extension, and then link them normally inside the head of the web page which we want to include them in. And then imported, we use the @import keyword to bring style sheets into another style sheet. So import is a way of bringing CSS rules from separate, disparate style sheets into a single style sheet. That's how you can remember the 4 different ways to style. Make sure you go to the Mozilla Developer Network and you look at link and style. These are 2 HTML elements that are critical when it comes to the ways to style. Pay attention to the examples and see me with any questions. Then I have a challenge for you. It's called Ways to Style, where you're going to get to practice the 4 different methods of including style to apply to a web page. Okay, let's do a little demonstration. I have a web page here, and as you can tell, I have an H1 heading, I have a paragraph, and I have an image. Right now, the image is way too big for the page. I'm going to demonstrate the different ways to style through a real-world example. So let's say I wanted to use inline style. Inline style is when HTML and CSS are mixed. Specifically, inline style uses the style attribute. You use the style attribute in the opening part of the elements tag to style it. So for example, I need to change this image so it fits on the page. I can style the image by using the style attribute and then having a property value combination here. So in this way, I can style using the style attribute. This is called inline because it's in the line. The HTML and CSS are mixed. This isn't necessarily a great way to do things, so we try to do it a different way. So let's say I wanted to use embedded style. Embedded style is when I go into the head of my document and I use the style element to place CSS rules in. So I normally want to say it's text CSS, and then what I can do is I can create traditional CSS style rules. So for example, if I wanted to style all my images, I would use my image selector to choose all the images on the page, and then I would say, okay, I want my images to have a width of 100%. Basically just take up the amount of space that's available. I want their height to be auto. And in this way, no matter how many images I place on the page, it will style them. And they'll all look the same. Okay? So that is what we call embedded. All the CSS rules are cordoned off into their own area, normally inside the head of the document. And in this way, everything on the page is affected by the rules. Another thing that you can do is external style. Let's say I didn't want the style inside my document at all. I wanted it in a separate file. What you could do is you could come over here and you could create a style sheet. And we can call it style.css. Thimble likes to put some stuff in there to begin with, but I'm going to get rid of that stuff. Now what we can do is we can write the same rule we did before for our images. We want the width to be 100%. Let's say the height is auto. And at this point, I have a separate style sheet, .css. It's got one style rule in it. But if I go to my index.html, my page still isn't what I want it to be because I need to link in the style sheet. So once I link in my style sheet, it will be included and all of the rules that I've written in here will apply to the web page. Now, last but not least, let's do imported style. If I go to Google Fonts, for example, and I want to use this cool font, what I can do is I can click on the plus sign and it will give me a bunch of different options. One of the options it'll give me is import. I'm going to steal this import command. And I'm going to go back to my style sheet and I'm going to put it in the top of my style sheet. This import command will bring in all of the style from this web call. So we're bringing in rules from the outside and we're including them within our style sheet. And then what I can do is say, I want all my text to use the barrio typeface, font face, and there we are. Notice how the page has changed. Now I am using the CSS rules, the font information from this outside source. So I had to import it from an outside party to include it within my style sheet. Then you will notice that all I have is one style sheet linked into the head of my document. So these are the 4 different ways to style.